Do you
Nicole?
somebody is needing to.
Carmen.
Is everyone muted? I'm going to try to forge ahead. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to have so many familiar faces and new faces in the room tonight. I want to greet our distinguished board members, our new board president, Bill Lorman, our past board president, Wally Fletcher, our vice president, Marie Hartke, our past president, Barbara Smith. And I see a few of our society members. Thank you so much for joining us. I see some of our candidates in training. I looked at the guest list, and we have people calling in from around the country, and we have some Canadian colleagues as well. So welcome all. And I'm happy to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Richard Friedman. Dr. Friedman has been a member of our Society of Analysts for a long time. It's so nice to have an opportunity to speak with him and to hear his thoughts. He graduated from the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies in the second class of that institute, so early on. He taught for many years at a number of psychoanalytic institutes, and he's published articles in several journals, including 2 papers in modern psychoanalysis, and has authored many book reviews and chapters in 3 books. And his private practice is in New York City. And this evening, he'll be talking to us about the concept of charisma from a psychoanalytic perspective. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Friedman.
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'm looking forward to a conversation with all of you. And not just questions, I really look forward to your comments as well. The Oxford English Dictionary named Riz, R-I-Z-Z, its 2023 Word of the Year. The New York Times article about Riz defined it as Gen Z slang for style, charm, or attractiveness, or, quote, the ability to attract a romantic or emotional partner. Riz is a shortened form of the word charisma, what the Times called a popular synonym for attractiveness or sex appeal. While Riz is a fun addition to our language, I'm interested in charisma in its original Weberian sense as the almost magical quality that some people have to stop other people from thinking critically or to open people up to thoughts and feelings they otherwise never would have experienced. That the word charisma has degenerated in common usage to become what I think of as a superfluous synonym for attractive deprives us of Weber's useful meaning of someone who is listened to. We now have people speaking or riding of charismatic dogs or automobiles. The question of what makes an individual or a dog or an automobile attractive is an interesting one. That's not what I'll talk about this evening. My curiosity is about persuasiveness. This evening, I'm going to discuss charisma as someone who has been a psychoanalyst for a very long time, and someone who has been thinking about charisma even longer. As an undergraduate, long before I gave any thought to becoming a psychoanalyst, I was introduced to the thought of Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R, is German, by my teacher Hans Goethe, one of Weber's translators and a major Weber scholar. Weber, Sigmund Freud's rival for title of preeminent German-speaking social scientist of the 20th century, introduced the idea of charisma. Weber said he took the word from a church historian, a contemporary of his and Freud's, named Rudolf Sohm, S-O-H-M, who, quote, brought out the sociological peculiarity of this category of domination structure for a historically important special case, namely the historical development of the authority of the early Christian church. Weber secularized the initially theological concept to include any situation of leadership. He defined charisma as referring, I'm quoting again, to an extraordinary quality of person, regardless of whether this quality is actual, alleged, or presumed. Charismatic authority refers to a rule over men to which the governed submit because of their belief in the extraordinary quality of a specific person. Goethe, my teacher, when discussing Weber's idea of charisma, frequently paraphrased Jesus, the model of a charismatic person. It is written, but I say unto you. Of course, many people preface a remark with Goethe's paraphrase. Goethe's point was that, unlike most speakers, after Jesus spoke, many were convinced by what he had said. That's charisma. A quotation from the recent obituary in the New York Times of Peter C. Newman, a Canadian journalist, captures Weber's definition of charisma. Mr. Newman was married and divorced several times. He attributed one of his divorces to, and I'm quoting again, a theological dispute. I thought I was God, and she didn't. For that ex-wife, Mr. Newman lacked charisma. The key element in charisma is that of being listened to, especially when uttering unusual or original ideas. The charismatic person has the power to change minds. And what else ultimately is psychoanalysis about? Charisma plays an essential role in the psychoanalytic process because we know that when people talk in the right way, they change. Our goal in psychoanalysis is to help people come to us in emotional pain, say everything. Our technique is based in part on the conviction that an analysand is helped to say everything when they hear our words, what we call, I think somewhat pretentiously, our interventions, words that have perhaps they have perhaps heard before someplace else, but were never able really to listen to. There's almost no psychoanalytic literature on charisma, at least labeled as such. Weber suggested why. Social scientists, and Weber would include psychoanalysts among them, tend to treat words the way other people treat toothbrushes. They would never put someone else's in their own mouths. This reluctance to recognize value in ideas created elsewhere is a loss for our profession. In those few writings by psychoanalysts about charisma, for example, the book by Irvine Schiffer, a Canadian, there's several Canadians here this evening. The name of the book is Charisma, a Psychoanalytic Look at Mass Society. The focus tends to emphasize the transferential qualities of charisma. I don't find this a particularly useful approach. There's one partial exception. The Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich about Hitler's rise to power. This is by far the best description of charisma I've ever read. And interestingly, Reich uses neither the word charisma nor does he acknowledge any debt to Weber. I have no idea if he'd ever read Weber. He might have come on with this stuff all by himself. What has kept me from going public with my thoughts about charisma is that I have not been able to answer what, for me, is the key question. Well, I think I know how some people are charismatic, and I'll share some of those thoughts with you this evening. What I can't figure out is why that person is listened to and another person using seemingly identical language and techniques isn't. A parallel mystery is why some people listen to him, not to me, especially when he's spouting nonsense and I'm offering wisdom. Weber does not even acknowledge this as a mystery. I still don't have answers to these questions, but in trying to answer them, I've come up with some other stuff that help you find interesting and perhaps useful in your practices. I am certain that someday someone smarter than me will come up with a scientific answer for these mysteries, perhaps one of you this evening. In the meantime, I'll revert to the ancient practice of referring to the inexplicable as magic. While I can't explain the magic, I think I know at least some of how it is achieved. This evening, I'll speak about charisma in general. Charisma is a factor in teaching psychoanalytic ideas, and charisma, or at least the phenomenon that could be understood as charisma, in psychoanalytic practice. Rudolf Zohm, the historian, Weber took the word charisma from, explained charisma as a gift from God, an explicitly Christian phenomenon. And I find it interesting that the Hebrew scriptures are remarkable for people, Jonah, Moses, Jeremiah, who complained that no one listens to them. It's only with the New Testament and Jesus that people listen and change their minds when someone inspired by God speaks. And even Jesus complained at one point. A prophet is without honor in his own country, among his own kin, and in his own house. Weber's genius was to understand that the charismatic power to persuade also occurs in secular contexts and without divine help. The charismatic leader is persuasive when his followers identify, consciously or unconsciously, with his power. Believing the charismatic person to be strong makes the follower feel strong as well, and the new belief makes up for subjective deficits the follower suffers from, for example, feeling victimized or humiliated. One of the mechanisms used often by charismatic leaders is hypnosis, although I have no evidence that any famous charismatic speaker either studied hypnosis or consciously understood they were hypnotizing their audiences. Charismatic speech tends to have a compelling cadence. I do not know either German or Italian, and that makes it easier for me to recognize the hypnotic rhythms when I listen to recordings of Hitler's or Mussolini's speeches, Hitler and Mussolini being exemplars of charismatic leadership. Because I don't hear the repugnant content of what they say, I, with a willing suspension of memory, can allow myself to experience just a little bit of the emotional pull of Hitler's and Mussolini's rhythms. To paraphrase Winnicott on babies and mothers, there's no such thing as a charismatic leader. There are only charismatic leaders and their followers, or what I think could more accurately be labeled the enchanted. Charisma is transactional. It occurs in reciprocal contexts. Not only does the enchanted person feel understood, the charismatic leader is heard. And that seems to fulfill a common need of charismatic people, who are often exhibitionists and almost always narcissists. While anyone in the right setting might have a little charisma for a handful of people, having charisma felt by many is an unusual talent. All charismatic people are good actors. Nietzsche once said, must not anyone who wants to move the crowd be an actor who impersonates himself. Feeling enchanted, while far more common than having charisma, is also unevenly distributed, with some people only rarely feeling enchanted and others eagerly seeking enchantment and feeling it often. No leader has ever had universal charisma. The appeal of the charismatic leader has to correspond to a specific emotional fantasy or need of the enchanted. Wilhelm Reich analyzes Hitler's appeal to the deep humiliation felt by his followers and promised them that, through identification with him, they'd once again feel powerful and important. Millions of Germans and Austrians felt the appeal. For everyone else, Hitler had the Gestapo. One rough index of charismatic appeal is its strength of the revulsion of those who are not enchanted. Non-charismatic people, positions of authority, might bore or annoy audiences who are not convinced by their arguments, but they typically don't arouse personal hatred. Up to this point, I've used charisma consistently with Weber as a quality that helps the enchanted accept a new thought or feeling, as if the thought or feeling had been external. I want to suggest that a charismatic leader often echoes what is already in the unconscious of the enchanted. The charismatic encounter liberates what had been suppressed or repressed. To be fair, this is an old idea, first suggested by Plato 2,400 years before Weber, when he demonstrated that which we experience as learning is actually remembering what had been in our minds all along. Finally, an observation about charisma that, while obvious, still needs to be stated. The person with charisma has the power either to liberate the enchanted's evil inclinations and hatred, or the enchanted's potential for generativity and love. In this sense, charisma is a neutral power, and someone with charisma has an obligation to be aware of how they are using their gift. I've had only one experience of being enchanted in a charismatic encounter, and I'm going to tell you about it because I think it illustrates a lot of what I've just talked about. I walk to work every morning through Central Park in New York City, often taking the famous jogging path around the reservoir for part of the trip. When the Democratic National Nominating Convention was held in New York in the summer of 1992, I saw then Governor Bill Clinton running in the park about 50 feet ahead of me, along with about half a dozen Secret Service agents. He just received his party's official nomination and was scheduled to give his acceptance speech that evening. I shouted out, "Good luck, Governor!" Clinton turned around and jogged over to me. It happened that I'd mailed him a check for, as I recall, $24 that morning to the Clinton campaign. When Clinton reached me, holding out his hand to shake mine, I told him about the check, including the amount. Clinton, still holding my hand with both of his, looked me in the eyes and said, "Thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it and how much that means to me." For $25. At that moment, I knew my contribution was going to be the decisive factor in his election, and that I was the most important person in the world to him. Not just because I'd sent him money, but because my support was what he had been waiting for. And Clinton somehow conveyed he felt exactly as I did. Our whole encounter lasted maybe 30 seconds, and as soon as it was over, I realized how ludicrous my response had been. But during that half minute, I was completely enthralled. If Clinton had asked me at that moment to invade Poland, I would have rushed out to buy jackboots. I've met politicians and famous artists, actors, and musicians. I've never before or since had the experience I had that morning with Bill Clinton. Let's move away from religion and politics and look at charisma as it applies to psychoanalysis. First, I want to discuss some psychoanalysts as charismatic figures, and then analysands as participants in a variant of the charismatic experience. There's little, if any, difference between the magic of charisma and some of what we do. By frankly acknowledging the magical aspects of our craft, we can paradoxically hope for the benefits of science as well. There's predictability, teachability, and a sense of ethical limits. Charisma comes up in how psychoanalytic ideas are taught and innovations are conveyed. From its earliest days, charisma has been central to the dissemination of psychoanalysis. Freud, someone who must have been highly charismatic, convinced an entire generation of people to accept the shocking idea that our actions are often out of our conscious control, and much of what we do is motivated by unconscious yearnings for sex and violence. I do not think Freud's ideas would have been recognized outside of a tiny esoteric cult had he been less charismatic. People participating this evening might have special interest in Hyman Spotnitz, for many another charismatic psychoanalyst. I was in both individual supervision and group analysis with Spotnitz, and I attended dozens of his lectures. I got to witness firsthand his impact on people. Hitching my psychoanalytic career to Spotnitz's star was an accident, not the consequence of his charisma. When I decided as a young man and still an academic historian that I needed the help of a psychoanalyst, I sought a referral from my only friend with a psychoanalyst parent. My friend's mother referred me to someone enchanted by Spotnitz, a person I'd never heard of. Had I wandered instead into the office of an orthodox Freudian or an Adlerian or a Jungian, I would today probably be an orthodox Freudian, Adlerian, or Jungian, and I'm sure I would have found much of value in their approaches. Fate led me, however, to Spotnitz, and I consider myself lucky. It's not that I think my time as an analysand with someone who was not a follower of Spotnitz would have been less valuable. There are many talented healers who are not modern psychoanalysts. Rather, I am the beneficiary of a charismatic psychoanalytic teacher who could say in a convincing way that while Freud was important, learning about what helps people change did not stop in 1939 with Freud's death. By far, the best thing I learned from Spotnitz was when he told me the difference between himself and other psychoanalysts was that when he was in training, everyone else was there to become a psychoanalyst, but he was there to learn how to help people. Spotnitz did not look or sound the part of a charismatic leader. He was less than average height, unathletic looking, bespectacled, and totally bald. He often quoted one of his patients who called him a billiard ball on a cue stick. His voice tended to squeak, and his speech patterns were not hypnotic. However, my own psychoanalyst and my teachers at the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies spoke of him and to him with awe. I did not experience him as charismatic. I didn't like him. I would be bewildered that he had enchanted so many brilliant and discerning people if I were not a student of charisma and could accept the charismatic appeal he had for others, even if I never felt it myself. Fortunately, we can learn even from those we don't find charismatic, and we can sometimes benefit from the enchanted followers of a charismatic teacher. Spotnitz was not the first psychotherapist to suggest that there could be more to psychoanalytic therapy than having an analysand link their own story to the edible story. Almost from the beginning, Adler and Jung suggested alternative or additional stories, and both these men had the charisma to enchant their own followers, who turned Adlerian and Jungian myths into all-explaining systems of thought. Although I was never enchanted by Spotnitz, his enchantment of the founders of the Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies and the Philadelphia School of Psychoanalysis gave me the authority to speak publicly of heterodox ideas, and with these powerful institutions behind me, the legitimacy to put my own ideas into practice. This has been important to me because I lack the charisma to have carried it off on my own. Many psychotherapists today exhibit disdain for charismatic healers. One certain road to scorn from other therapists is to appear charismatic or to get that reputation. In part, I'm sure this scorn stems from envy, but it must also come from genuine confusion. How can anyone believe so-and-so has special powers when I find him so totally lacking in appeal? Thus, our own lack of emotional imagination cuts us off from learning. In our scientific age, some charismatic leaders, among whom I include such modern therapeutic geniuses as Nathan Ackerman, Fritz Perls, Milton Erickson, and Hyman Spotnitz, have attempted to teach how they help people based on what they explained as systematic principles. To some extent, they all succeeded, but I suspect not for the reasons they claimed. Rather, therapists who follow a charismatic healer, starting with those enchanted by Freud himself. But by the way, Freud's real name was Freud himself. It's always referred to that way. Those enchanted by Freud himself feel ordained by their guru and basking in the glow of his special dispensation, convey to their own analysands the confidence of the elect. This confidence gives them a variant of charisma. I'm going to speak more about this in a few minutes, but first I'm going to speak about charisma in the consulting room. Charisma is integral to the psychoanalytic process. I was reminded of Hans Gerth's often repeated description of charisma as it is written, but I say unto you, shortly after beginning work with Mr. A many years ago. Mr. A, now in another profession, had been a successful politician. Many of the policies he liked had been adopted, but those ideas were not original with him, nor was he uniquely instrumental in their becoming law. Other ideas, new and imaginative solutions to long-standing social problems that he enthusiastically endorsed, failed to become policy. He came to believe that his support of a new idea virtually guaranteed that it would be ignored, postponed, mocked, or rejected, a kind of magical grandiosity that he spoke of with self-depreciating humor as his negative charisma. After a while, we came to call it his Cassandra complex, following Freud's custom of going to Greek mythology to name universal phenomena. Cassandra was a beautiful princess, the daughter of Priam and Hecuba. Apollo fell in love with her, and he offered her the gift of prophecy if she would have sex with him. She initially agreed, but then she changed her mind. Apollo was furious at Cassandra, and he came up with the cruelest and most ingenious punishment. He'd give her the gift of prophecy, all right, but no one would believe her. Whenever she spoke, everyone who heard her would think she was crazy. When I worked with Mr. A, it occurred to me that his complaint, his Cassandra complex, was a common one. I realized that I'd heard the complaint of not being heard from many of the people I had worked with. This is not the familiar cry that no one understands my pain. Rather, this is an expression of frustration that no one listens to my good ideas on how things should be done. Expressions of Cassandrahood are often accompanied by complaints that when so-and-so says the same thing, everyone else listens and follows up on the idea. People who complain about not being listened to are complaining that they are not charismatic. I found it useful to share this insight with the Cassandras in my practice. It helps them to say everything, including ultimately expressions of ambivalence about being heard, which I think is often a block to people being charismatic when they want to be. While I'm speaking this evening primarily about charisma, I've now brought up the idea of what I call the narrative framework, and this is an idea that needs a little explanation. We instruct people to say everything, but no one can say anything without the necessary vocabulary or appropriate narrative framework. Often the words and stories have to come from the analysts. For Freud and his most orthodox followers, the ideal narrative framework is the Oedipal story. Anything else is either resistance or a therapeutic parameter. While the Oedipal story is a good one, and perhaps, as Freud believed, a universal experience, limiting our stories to just Oedipus is a Procrustean bed. There are many other stories that might be more appropriate to help a person say everything. All the stories, including Freud's beloved Oedipal stories, are what I call narrative frameworks. I suggest narrative frameworks to most of the people I work with when I can hear a theme the person struggles to articulate. In the decades since I first identified Mr. A's Cassandra complex, I've told perhaps a dozen people that they were suffering from Cassandra complex. And this became a theme for a session or two, and for a few people, such as Mr. A, one of the recurring themes in their analysis. The Cassandra complex is only one of many stories I've suggested. I've also drawn other narrative frameworks from classical literature, from the Bible, as well as from lyrics to popular songs, the plot lines of movies or TV shows, from jokes, current events, and from reframed versions of stories analysts themselves have brought into our work, which could be seen, I think, as another way of joining the resistance. I found social theory to be a particularly rich mine of frameworks. Just one example, telling depressed people about Emile Durkheim's theory of anomie has been particularly useful. What is important to remember in this context is that alternative narrative frameworks can be helpful only when the analyst has enough, and let me say it, charisma for the analysand to accept the metaphor and use it to riff on a new theme. In every successful analysis, the analysand has to experience their analyst as sufficiently charismatic to accept the new thoughts and feelings that come up. Because very few psychoanalysts are naturally charismatic, some of our analysands cannot accept some of the hard things we tell them about their unconscious minds or the narrative frameworks we suggest to help them talk. Then we have to find a way to help our analysands hear us. Of course, many people we work with believe anything we say. For them, their analyst automatically has a kind of charisma. This is closely related to Weber's idea of a hereditary charisma. Weber had two. He had the naturally occurring charisma of Jesus, and then the hereditary charisma of the early church leader. Hereditary charisma is the charisma of office. Even the blandest pope, king, or president, or psychoanalyst will, for some people, have a built-in charisma of official office and title, not because of their personality, but because of their job. Hereditary charisma in psychoanalysis differs from other kinds of hereditary charisma in having an element of reciprocity. Not only does the analysand hear and believe new thoughts from the analyst must be able to hear and the sometimes unpleasant things from that the analysand says. The reciprocity is not symmetrical. The analyst charisma is a kind of magic. The analysand is what I'm calling charisma in the narrow technical sense of being heard by their analysts. It's mostly because the analyst has worked hard to be able to tolerate hearing what others can't. In analysis, however, sometimes hereditary charisma is not enough. Then, leaning into their status of having been ordained by a charismatic guru or certified by an institute identified with a charismatic founder, might enhance the analyst charisma, what might be called tribal charisma. Modern analysis, somebody will identify themselves part of a tribe. While calling the analytic dyad hereditary or tribal charisma could be considered just another way of labeling transference, I believe psychoanalytic charisma to be something more. Whatever analysands bring to their transference, they also see in their analyst, even when they transferentially experience their analyst as rejecting or abandoning, someone with the godlike power to make conscious that which had been unconscious. That is, the implicit promise that they will be heard. I suspect, by the way, that the failure of a new analysand to come back for a second session, while often just a product of fear, is often sometimes a failure of that person to feel enchanted by their would-be analysts. These people often say they did not continue with the referral because it wasn't a good fit. I suggest a different metaphor would be more useful in understanding these failed relationships. The prospective analysand could not imagine ever experiencing the analyst as charismatic. This is more than calling a prospective analysand's reluctance to continue a treatment destructive resistance. It's arrogant for an analyst to characterize his own lack of charisma as a treatment destructive resistance on the part of a potential analysand. If a prospective analysand cannot find hope for charisma, the treatment will lack the basis in magic for any hope of success. Sadly, other than openly identifying with a psychoanalytic guru, prestigious institution, or psychoanalytic tribal affiliation, I don't know any other techniques to enhance an analyst's charisma. By the way, even Spotnitz, perhaps sensing that I was not enchanted by him, told me at least twice that his own analyst had been analyzed by Freud himself. The term charisma is now commonly applied to therapists, sometimes as a positive attribute, especially for group healers, but more often as a pejorative term for therapists who are out of the mainstream. There's a historical connection between charisma and healing, however. And the power of pre-Freudian charismatic healers might be available to even the most rational and scientific of 21st century therapists if we examine the phenomenon of charisma dispassionately. What we would today call psychotherapy predates Sigmund Freud by thousands of years. Joseph's dream interpretation was a kind of therapy when he sought to ease Pharaoh's troubled spirit. Since Freud, however, we claim scientific validity for our therapeutic practices. In discussing charisma, I am reintroducing pre-scientific elements into the continuing debate about what helps heal in therapy. Charisma can be a powerful healing tool, perhaps even the most powerful. Freud himself acknowledged this late in his life when he wrote, "I do not think our cures can compete with those of Lourdes. but reliance solely on charisma is a hindrance to real scientific healing, which is always grounded in a body of learning that includes an understanding of transference and counter-transference, as well as resistances to saying everything. And we have to remember, our analysands can only say everything when we can hear everything, including the ugly stuff. The charisma is not to be scorned by the healer. There's much magic in what we do. Our analysand's expectations that we can help them to emotional fulfillment gives us initial leverage with which to begin the long and sometimes painful road to change. Thank you. And now, Ray, if anybody have any comments or questions?
I haven't seen anything in the chat yet, so are there any questions?
I can start off with a question.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. As you're talking about charisma and analytic experience, I'm wondering about how well it conveys over the phone or over with telehealth versus in person. What are some of the things that go along with charismatic impact? And as I'm saying that, one thing I'm noting is eye contact and how that can be part of it, or the hand holding that Bill Clinton did with you.
And Bill Clinton also was staring into my eyes the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
It's an excellent question. I think that's part of a larger question since COVID of the most of our practices have moved from being almost exclusively in person to largely, if not exclusively, online. And I don't really have an answer to that. Most of the people I'm seeing on Zoom had spent time with me in person and had worked with me long enough so that whatever situational charisma I had as an analyst was already established. I have started with a few new people since COVID who did. I'm back in my office one day a week, so I've seen most of them in person, at least for a short period of time initially, before some of them moved to Zoom. I don't know. I'd be interested in what your experiences are. All of you are seeing people on Zoom. Is it work for me? Zoom has worked pretty well. Has anybody found that they're less effective in establishing, at least initially, a working relationship because they've only seen the person on Zoom?
My practice is solely on Zoom these days, probably the last 3 years, and I haven't really noticed any negative variables at all. First of all, Dr. Friedman, I want to thank you for an excellent presentation. And
thank you for saying that. I don't know who's speaking. It doesn't show on my screen.
Oh, this is Christopher speaking.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. As I was listening to your presentation, I was really looking at my own definition of charisma, being a analyst in training. And, for myself, I was thinking perhaps like some personality variables, such as being warm and being open and, creating that space for patients to be themselves and using humor appropriately, drawing people in. And, and I was thinking basically that's my style. So as you were talking, I resonated, a lot with what you were saying.
What you're saying is true, and I think it's true for many people. I was speaking before with Lisa before we began, and we were talking a little bit about Jerry Lucas, who was a very charismatic individual. He is a person with natural charisma. He didn't just have the charisma that he borrowed, but because he would study with Spotnitz or whatever. And Jerry Lucas, at least I'd never experienced him as he had a good sense of humor, but he was not, Lisa, correct me, he was not warm and welcoming. He could be quite fierce and attacking.
Intimidating, yes.
Intimidating, and he knew that. We trained together. He graduated in the first class, I graduated in the second class, but we were in a lot of classes together. He consciously used his power of intimidation as a therapeutic tool. He knew himself, and it made him an effective analyst. So perhaps it isn't just being open. You're an open and welcoming person, and you're using that. But I think the key is you're using yourself. You're using who you are. Jerry Lucas used his intimidating qualities, and he had other qualities as well. But he would use, I think every effective therapist uses who they are. And perhaps being honest, not a faker, is what's important. And that's exactly the opposite in some ways of Nietzsche's definition of the charismatic political leader, who's a good actor. Although Nietzsche does say he's a good actor who's impersonating himself. He's not impersonating somebody else. They're reaching into your soul to find something that will appeal to the audience.
I find what you're saying so fascinating. And I'm of a number of minds about it. One is, and part of it was, the car salesman kind of thing that almost like you were saying earlier, a dishonesty or a cult leader or something like that. And so that charisma is dangerous. But I do think, I think it's fascinating to be aware, and I think we all as therapists know that we have some kind of power in the room. And generally, I mean, I think it's much, much more powerful in person. I'm anti-virtual because thinking virtual is actual, you really have relationships over the phone or over the whatever. So I'm very fascinated. Thank you so much. It's bringing up, as you can probably see, my mind is still going round and round about it. It's very, very interesting.
Thank you, Maggie. And you're raising an important point. I want to make a distinction. A used car salesman, the stereotypic used car salesman, is not necessarily charismatic. They often use hypnotic techniques. It's an overlap of technique, but they don't necessarily have any charisma. And I practiced hypnotherapy. About 20 years ago, I decided that as I aged, I would be reluctant to take somebody on for a long-term analysis, but I didn't want to retire. And I would continue, obviously, with the people I'm working with, but there would be attrition, and I wanted to keep my practice up. And I thought hypnotherapy would be a good way of doing that because it's very short term. So I know something about hypnosis. It's a way of saying that. Effective salesmen, including honest salesmen,
Yes.
often use hypnotic techniques, but that does not necessarily mean they're charismatic, except in a very narrow sense that they can convince you to buy something you wouldn't otherwise buy. But it's, and that's one-on-one in any case, like a therapist. politically charismatic, sometimes they overlap with used car salesmen, but not always. Some of them are have the power to persuade in honest ways or life-enhancing ways. Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Jack Kennedy when he was at his best, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. I don't know if Lincoln was charismatic or not. He seemed to, and we obviously don't have any films of him. People responded to him in funny ways. That's a different story. But anyway, it's an interesting problem in discussing charisma.
I would like to think that my sincerity and genuineness comes across, and that's what's, charismatic. If I am charismatic, but not necessarily the, trying to convince somebody to give me $1 million. Although I'd like to know how to do that.
I think being genuine is obviously an important aspect of some people's charisma, but I've known highly charismatic crooks, including, I hate to say this, including some psychoanalysts, known psychoanalysts who had big practices, who were, I thought, had bad character, let me put it that way. They lied, they cheated, and they abused their power, including for money and for sex. So it isn't.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Don't want to interrupt you.
I'm done.
Oh, well, I was just thinking that in a way, when you think about Jesus and Hitler and Mussolini and most of the people I think of as charismatic, a definitional requirement is that they not be able to hear you or interested in anything you have to say, except if you're following them. I don't think Jesus was terribly interested in what his audience thought, except if they listened to him. He was probably very interested in that. So in a way, it's almost the opposite. And now, when I heard this is going to be the topic of your talk, I immediately thought, well, you'll talk about Donald Trump, because most people think he's very charismatic. And I think he is, in the terms of some of your definitional things, that he has to have a following, or I forgot what you called them, enchanted, right? He certainly has a group of enchanted people. And I think what I'm not clear on, or I mean, who could be clear on it? But I'm thinking that certain obvious things about Trump and ideas about why he has been so effective. Well, one, I'm sure, is this narcissism. His projection that he is on top, he'll always be on top. And if you join him, you who are like him, the other thing is the like him business. Namely, you're full of hate, you're prejudiced against Black people, you want to be able to do wicked things and have it be okay. And he does that for people. He makes them feel there's some hope, very much like Hitler. You're not an oppressed, wicked country. You're a rising, blessed power who will have the whole world at your disposal. I don't know what I'm saying, except that those qualities, are they part of the definition of charisma, or are they other qualities that lead to powerful leadership?
Jack, I agree with 90% of what you're saying. First of all, your description of Hitler is straight out of Wilhelm Reich. I think to understand Trump, the best thing I've read on Donald Trump is Wilhelm Reich's book on Hitler, the Mass Psychology of Fascism. This identification with the powerful person and feeling free to and comfortable with your worst impulses. It legitimizes it. But I'm in my talk, I made an explicit distinction between the analyst as a charismatic figure and a political figure. When the analyst is a charismatic figure, it has an element that's not at all like the political. You're right about the politician. The politician's not listening. He just wants to be heard and seen. The analyst hears the patient, and I didn't know what word to use. I use scare quotes. The patient becomes charismatic in this narrow Weberian sense. The patient can be heard by the analyst. Although I think that's possible, not because the person in analysis develops the magic of charisma that the analyst has to have, but because of our training, where we spend years in our own personal analysis and in supervision, learning to listen to stuff and hear stuff that the analysand has said all his life, but no one's heard.
No, I absolutely agree with you that an analysis, not only the capacity, but the actuality of listening, and especially listening to things that haven't been said earlier, that haven't been recognized or felt by the patient earlier, is the essence of analysis. I
agree that, but I said that in my talk. That's
yeah, absolutely you did. But
so it's a special variant. I call it a special variant of charisma. The analyst has to have the magic, though, for the analysand. If the analyst doesn't have that magic for the analysand, it's not going to work.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, the whole thing is fascinating.
And by the way, Jack, I made a bet with myself on how long it would take before somebody started talking about Trump.
And you won the bet.
I thought it'd come up sooner.
Yeah, right. I did too, actually.
Trump is, I think, the most charismatic American politician of our lifetime, even more so than Bill Clinton or Jack Kennedy. But as I said, it's only for, you said I think you used the word majority of people. It isn't the majority of people. Right. Trump, the true followers of Trump, the ones who will think he was railroaded when he's convicted in New York and the end of this trial, or I don't know what percentage of the population, 20% of the population, 30% of the population. It's not a majority.
No, I didn't. I hope I didn't say majority, but yeah, right.
At least I hope it is. Who knows? It could be a majority. I hope it isn't, but it could be.
Well, that's what I'm hoping personally. Other people I've spoken to don't agree with me, but I think that with the country observing Trump sitting as a helpless victim, is going to remove some of that element that people need to think I can be like him. I mean, nobody wants that.
Jack, you're raising another interesting issue. It's aside from the psychoanalytic thing, but what removes the magic? What kills the magic? When Hitler lost the war and resulted in the death of, I forget how many millions of German civilians, but a significant percentage of the German population was killed in the war, not just soldiers. Germany lost about 2 million soldiers. Somebody can correct me if I have the number wrong. I think Germany lost 2 or 3 million civilians.
Sure.
As a direct result of Hitler's insane going to war for no reason. He just had this need to go to war. Many people after the war, they said, you know, they couldn't find any Nazis. Me, Nazi, never.
Right.
I think a lot of people were quite sincere in their instant amnesia to how enthusiastic they'd been about Hitler, but he still had true followers.
Yeah.
There were people who went to their graves thinking that Hitler said the right thing, he was the right guy, he had some bad luck, he was stabbed in the back, whatever. I don't, however they rationalized the loss. I don't know what causes people to look at a charismatic leader and say, this guy, why did I ever believe him? How could I have been so foolish or so horrible or whatever as to believe this monster? And I don't know, I don't have an answer to that.
Sure, you know.
If I can bring in a couple of questions, there's several in the chat room, if you don't mind.
Please.
The first question was, what made Dr. Spotnitz charismatic to others, but not to you?
That's the mystery. That's the question I started with. If I had had an answer to that, I would have published on charisma 40 years ago, and I'd be known today as a great social thinker. Charisma it is so far anyway a mystery. I can tell you what I didn't like about Spotnitz, but I don't think it'd be particularly helpful.
Oh, I'd love to hear it.
I thought he was very narcissistic. He was grandiose. I think I'll be personal about it. He could not tolerate me having an idea.
Oh my God. You're the only.
When I was in supervision with him, if I had a thought, he had to put it down.
God almighty. Am I still on? Can you hear me?
Of course, Jack.
You're the only person I've met, and I've talked about this with almost everyone I know who has been with Spotnitz, which is like 30, 40 people. You're the only one who had the same experience I had with him. And I was, by the way, in his captivated or whatever, enchanted group for a couple of decades. But eventually, I came to think exactly what you're just saying. Exactly. And I can't, well, thank you, Richard. Everybody thinks I'm a nut, an anti-Spotnitz nut.
But by the way, for the benefit of everybody participating, Jack and I have known each other for 50 years. We're old friends. So
when I like the, especially, could you leave out the word old?
we're longtime friends. How's that?
That's much better. Thank you. Amazing.
And so if I can continue.
Yes.
So there's a question about the ambivalence as a block to charisma. And he asked if you could say more. And in your studies on this subject, have you encountered discussion of the role of conviction and or confidence?
Yeah, I'll do both. I suspect that many of you, I won't include myself among you, have the innate ability to be more charismatic than you are. But it has a power connected to it that is scary. And we move away, most people move away from that. There's a lot of really talented people out there who do not look in the mirror and see the President of the United States reflected back. Some people do. Those people are not afraid of this. I was an historian, and years ago I read letters from Abraham Lincoln, and I did not make a note at the time. I cannot place them. I don't remember what it was, but Lincoln was afraid of power, of his own power. Lincoln wrote in the letter, and I'm probably badly paraphrasing it. It's been 50 years since I've read this. Lincoln said, and I'm paraphrasing, I have the ability to have power, and I have the ability not only to have power, but to become a dictator. I have it in me to become a dictator, and I'm afraid to become president because I'm afraid that I will give in to that power. That's the ambivalence that I think inhibits some people from fully allowing their natural charisma to come out. What was the second half of the question? It was in two parts.
Yeah, it was around conviction and or confidence,
yes.
which seems to kind of blend in with what you're talking
Right.
about.
There was a psychologist, an educational psychologist at Harvard named Rosenthal, who wrote what did he call it? Expectation studies. The expectation of the teacher has a lot to do with outcome. What he did was he had a group of graduate students and he lied to them. He got a group of genetically identical mice. They're kind of little white mice that are used in experiments. And he put ink dots on half of them and left ink dots up the other half. Then he invited a group of graduate students in and he told them that these mice look a lot alike, but for the last 100 generations of mice breeding, the group with the dots had been selected as the fastest learners, going through the mazes and doing the other mouse tricks. And these mice were super geniuses. With enough, spend a little time with these mice, you'll have them speaking Greek and doing calculus. These are the smartest mice that ever were. The other mice are just the opposite. Selectively breeded from the slowest mice, the ones who couldn't find their way through the maze. These mice are so dumb, they get lost in the maze. They don't know anything. These were genetically identical. He was lying. This was a complete lie. And then he had the graduate students say, I want to see what you can do. See how far you can push these smart mice. And I know it's a waste of time, but I'm asking you to do it. Can you teach these dumb mice anything at all? And the outcome was exactly what you might expect. The smart mice learned all kinds of stuff, and the dumb mice didn't learn anything. What we convey to the people we work with helps determine the outcome. If somebody comes into your office and you say to them, I've never worked with this before, and frankly, I never worked with it before because I don't think anybody can help somebody like you, I'll give it a shot, but don't have any. If you're willing to waste your money, I'm willing to work with you. You're going to get a very different result than if you say, I'll work with you. I find that if I help somebody say everything and the person says everything, they change. And I've had very good results with this. You're going to get a very different outcome. No, I think confidence has a lot, the analyst's confidence has a lot to do with the outcome. But as several people have commented, it has to be a genuine in analysis. If you're a used car salesman, you can lie and get away with it. If you're an ethical practitioner of psychotherapy, you have to genuinely believe you can help the person. And I've had this happen. Some people have come to me, and for one reason or another, I didn't think I could help them. And you have to tell them. You don't have to. You can do anything you want. I told them that I was not the right therapist for them, and I would help them find a therapist who could work with their issue.
I'll take a break from the chat. There's someone with their hand up. Let me. Here we go, Marilyn.
Yeah, I saw a video recently, and I'm wondering if you think that's somewhat like what you were describing about the professor who his students believed him because
Rosenthal. His name was, I don't remember his first name.
okay. The video was before the video was shown, the person who was doing this said, I'm going to show you a video, and what I want you to look at is, it's going to be a video of two teams, 3 players each, and they're just passing the ball, basketball, to other members of the group. And what I want you to do is to watch and count how many passes each team makes. So he had us all do that, and I found I couldn't count it at all. And he had various reactions from other people. And then he said, I'm going to show you the video again. And this time, I don't want you to count anything. Just watch. And so he played it again. And it was fascinating to see someone dressed as a gorilla walking across the stage. I didn't see it before.
That's a classic hypnotherapy tape. There's different variants on it. You were in a trance. A trance is a number of things, but at essence is we're intensely concentrating on one thing.
Right.
And if you're so concentrated on one thing, everything else is blocked out. That's the basis of a lot of hypnotherapy, obviously for pain relief, but for other things as well. That was probably done. I mentioned Milton Erickson. Milton Erickson was the father of modern hypnotherapy, and that tape was probably prepared by either by Erickson himself or by one of his followers.
Great. And now another question. How much of charisma is simply a projection from the enchanted that the charismatic person is willing or eager to inhabit and skillful at doing so?
Great question. Maybe all of it. There's no such thing as a charismatic leader. There's only the charismatic and the enchanted. They need each other. And the projection is everything. It's a neat observation.
And might there be a connection between charisma and fostering a narcissistic transference?
Well, that never occurred to me at all, and I'm going to have to think about that. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? That thought just wasn't in my head at all.
I put the question in, and I do have some thoughts on it. This is Esther again. There's something about this being listened to, this being heard, this identification that you were talking about Trump fostering with people. I'm liking listening to you, you're liking listening to me, this back and forth connection between people that is part of this narcissistic transference, this joining, that we do have this similarity. And it seems to be, in my mind, something similar. I don't know if anybody else has some other ideas about that.
Esther, what you said makes sense to me. I'm going to have to give it more thought, though. It's an interesting movement. I prepared these remarks really only to be given this evening, but the today walking around, I was wondering what I'm going to do next. I like to have a project. I thought maybe I'll try to work this up as a paper to be published someplace. And that might be something that I will include. I'm going to have to give it a lot more thought.
Mhm.
So thank you.
Actually, I think if I talk again, it's okay.
Jack, it's always okay. I always love to hear you talk.
Okay. Well, you see that now I'm developing it. Definitely going to be an enchanted one of you, of your group. Anyway, I think the idea of a narcissistic transference, which is a huge part of modern psychoanalytic approach, what you did? I think that one essential element in trying to foster narcissistic transference is you don't say anything, and if possible, don't reveal anything that is not in the what would make the person feel okay, feel connected, identified with you. In other words, I'm not being clear. Can you make it more clear, Nicole?
It's a stain syntonic.
Yes, it has if Lou Ormond used to say funny things like a patient would come in and say, I think you're a criminal, and he would say, well, did you see my guns, or something like that. I mean, he would say something right along the line of what the patient is saying, so that they can develop a kind of identity that I think Trump's followers have, certainly with him. So maybe that is that part of charisma, or is that a separate avenue?
I think it's a parallel avenue. Off the top of my head, I have to think it through. It sounds parallel, but not the same. At least parallel for a while. Probably diverge off.
Another related question. You may have addressed this. Is positive transference related to charisma?
Well, I heard his positive transference, and then there was a blurb, and I couldn't hear the rest.
Is it related to charisma?
I'm going to give a somewhat overly simplistic answer. Think of it as a Venn diagram. There's charisma and there's transference, and there's a big overlap. But the overlap is not a perfect circle. Whether it's positive transference or negative transference, there's elements of charismatic enchantment. One of the differences is that the charisma that the analysand feels has to be almost immediate. Transference takes a while to develop. The person might have initial projections, but it isn't really a fully developed transference. That you might come in and your analyst might remind you of your Aunt Sophie, and you really love Aunt Sophie, and you project some kind of something onto the analyst that is not there, and the analyst is wise enough not to dissuade you that she's really not at all like your Aunt Sophie. But that initial feeling, oh, I really like her because she looks just like my Aunt Sophie.
Richard, you lost your sound.
Yeah, that was my fault. I'm sorry, Richard. If you could unmute yourself.
Okay, okay. I was talking about my Aunt Sophie. I don't know how far we got into it. If the person has this initial feeling, oh, I really like this woman. I've walked in first time, she looks just like my Aunt Sophie. It's kind of a transference, but that isn't really a full transference. It involves some, I don't know, whatever, like a prejudice. like seeing somebody from an ethnic minority that you have either positive or negative feelings about, even though you know nothing about the person. But as you begin to work together, the transference is deepened and becomes more nuanced. And you might, even if the analyst continues to stay syntonic, using Jack's point, and does everything in their power to continue to try to remind you of Aunt Sophie, other things are going to come up. There's reality things, scheduling, fees, how much the analyst says or doesn't say. My Aunt Sophie was never silent like that. My Aunt Sophie would laugh when I told her a joke. Whatever it might be. And the transference develops and deepens. Maybe I'm making a distinction that none of you see, but I sense a real distinction between the analyst's charisma and transference.
Oh, I think I would agree with you. I mean, who hasn't had someone come in and say, that was a great suggestion, but I didn't say anything. I didn't make any suggestion. And that's probably before any sort of treatment relationship or transference really would have developed. So yeah, I'm following you there. There were a couple more questions. This one goes back to Trump. His charisma, is it actually a delusional element that draws people toward him?
I think there's always a delusional quality to anybody's charisma. Martin Luther, people who experienced Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela as charismatic had a certain delusion. The delusion in the loose sense, we have fantasies about these charismatic people that we believe are true. The highly researched biographies that come out after the death of the charismatic figures. I'm thinking of Erik Erikson's biography of Gandhi, the stuff that came out about Gandhi after his death, about his sexuality and other things that was kept secret, or at least certainly not discussed while he was alive. But people had fantasies that Gandhi was a total celibate and that he was asexual. You know, that's a kind of delusion. And it was necessary, and Gandhi didn't go out of his way to dissuade people.
And we have another one here. Just an observation that having charismatic teachers, supervisors, and analysts can be very helpful to the training analyst who sometimes needs to channel their analyst for a time in order to work with patients since their own psychoanalytic identity is undeveloped.
I think that's an excellent observation. And the supervisor that I had who influenced me a lot more than Spotnitz was somebody who was also important in the early history of PSP, Marie Coleman Nelson. I don't know if anybody consider her a naturally charismatic person, but she was somebody I learned a lot from, and I really loved her. She was a powerful influence on me. I don't. Do any of you remember her? She would go down to Philadelphia, I think every week for a long time.
Saw a couple of heads nod.
I'm sorry?
I said I saw a couple heads nod.
Yeah, I did too. She was wonderful. So yeah, having these wonderful teachers I had. I mean, looking back on my teachers at CMPS, there's a woman, probably, I don't think she had anything to do with Philadelphia, and she died just a few years into the program. A woman named Leah Knuffmacher. I just fell in love with her. She was wonderful. And I learned huge amounts from her. I was in supervision for a while with a mutual friend of Nicole and Jack Kerman's, a woman named Aviva Sayers. In the paper, the mother of my friend who was an analyst who referred me to my analyst, that was Aviva Sayers. And I went into supervision with her for a while and learned a tremendous amount from her. So yeah, these are important people in my life, and important part of training. I think we all have Marie Coleman Nelsons and Aviva Sayers and Leah Knopfmachers.
You really should mention God, man, Nicole. Who was the head of the institute?
You mean Phyllis Meadow?
Phyllis Meadow.
No, thank you.
So her charisma reached you.
The Spotnitz was the guru of CMPS, but he didn't have anything to do with running the place. The place was CMPS was started by the energy and guts and ambition and dynamism of a woman named Phyllis Meadow, who had tremendous charisma for many people, and she absolutely revolted me. As I said, the index of a person's charisma is how strongly you're repelled by them. And also, I took classes with her. I learned a lot from her. She's very smart. But I really did not like her. The ones I mentioned are people I really liked.
So perhaps that's for another seminar. We can talk about that.
What people I like and didn't like?
Yeah.
Another question here is not then embedded charisma in the therapeutic relationship a barrier to analysis?
Resistance is a barrier to analysis. Life is a barrier to analysis. Analysis is made up of resistances, and we deal with them. I can't imagine analysis without charisma, a successful analysis without charisma.
It may be related to this question if I understand it well. Might that charisma become a resistance, in the sense that the transference can become a resistance?
Well, transference there is transference resistance.
Right.
Um,
Would charisma act the same? Would a resistance develop within that charismatic interplay as well?
I think the bigger problem is counter-transference. If the analyst is disciplined in their use of charisma, I'm using now in the narrowest sense, that anything I say will be believed. It's not a problem from the viewpoint of the analysand if the analyst only says things that will move the analysis along, help the person say everything. The problem is if the analyst uses this power, it's tremendous power, to be believed in a way that hinders progressive communication. I'll give it, to me, it's an embarrassing example, being self-revelatory here. Also, many years ago, I was working with a young man who had a very active sex life, lots and lots of sex partners, and he trying to remember the context. He liked to experiment with different kinds of things. He'd never even alluded to sadomasochism, though, and I didn't think that sadomasochism, physically enacted sadomasochism in the sex act, was part of his repertoire. And I made an allusion, I just used the expression whips and chains. I didn't even say it particularly pejoratively. or didn't have any value attached to it. I might have just asked the question, is there, what about whips and chains? Instead of asking about sadomasochism or commenting about sadomasochism in a more neutral way. And he came in the next session furious at me that I had somehow disrespected sadomasochism as what he saw as a legitimate expression of his sexuality. It turned out actually ultimately to be quite productive, and he did talk a lot about his own sadism, and it turned out to be a lot of sadistic fantasies, and so it ended up working in a positive way. But I had no idea what the impact of my words would be when I said it. So I just did it as a throwaway line. It's just, if anything, I think I was just trying to take what I thought might be a sensitive topic and treat it lightly as a way to encourage him to talk. I was really surprised that he responded so negatively to my choice of words.
I think someone here liked your charisma index and asked for you to say more about that in terms of the extent to which you don't like them.
Yeah, it's almost mechanical. I think you could almost quantify it. Bland people might interest you if they're saying something that's intrinsically interesting. You're really interested in, I don't know, dogs, and the blandest, ordinary, dullest person is also interested in dogs, and you can have an interesting conversation. If that bland person starts to talk about dogs, though, and you have no interest in dogs whatsoever, you're just going to find the person boring, put you to sleep. But if a highly charismatic person starts talking, and suddenly if Donald Trump, as I said, I think if there were a charisma index, Trump would be way up on it. If Trump started talking about dogs, Trump is the first president in, I don't know, I think since the 19th century not to have a dog. I don't know if he doesn't like dogs, but if Trump were to give a speech in which he said dogs are horrible, they're filthy, how can anybody stand such a thing? Some of his followers who up to until now had really liked dogs and even had dogs as pets would suddenly find their dogs repellent, might even have their dogs put down. He's that persuasive. And I don't want to lose my thought here. I'm kind of wandering. The people who would hear Trump talk about dogs in a negative way, even people who didn't like dogs, would be repelled by Trump. They wouldn't be bored by him. Trump has never bored anybody. Trump fascinates. Fascinates with enchantment, or he fascinates with revulsion and hatred, but he fascinates everyone. The mystery, the one I've alluded to over and over again this evening, is why Trump and not somebody else? I have no idea. Why Trump and who's the Republican senator from Texas, Cruz, and Ted Cruz seems to have zero charisma. You just, why Trump and not Ted Cruz? Ted Cruz has 4 times Trump's IQ and infinite more learning. Cruz is an educated man. Cruz turns people off. He doesn't exactly bore people, but he just, nothing. I don't know if that answers your question about the index. It's a way of thinking about charisma. When I was preparing this talk and talking with different friends about it, and I mentioned that Trump is highly charismatic, and a lot of people said, "Oh, he's not charismatic at all. How can you find him charismatic?" This is what I'm referring to. I don't have to find him charismatic. I asked them, people who commented me that way, "What's your feeling about Trump?" "I can't stand the son of a bitch. I hate him. He terrifies me. He's horrible." That's charisma. That's just the other side of it.
To me, what poor whites, middle America were left behind. They were forgotten. And what he represents is he's saying F you to Harvard and to elite and to that Obama guy who, he thought he was something because he, could put two sentences together. And that was it, because he was saying F you to all the people that had thought they were better than the poor white.
I can't urge all of you enough, if you've not read Wilhelm Reich's The Mass Psychology of Fascism, to read it. I think it's the best thing on Trump ever written, and it was written in 1940.
And what's the name again?
The Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm, Wilhelm Reich, Reich. I have a Trumpist in my family, and I'm curious, by the way, I'm speaking as if with the assumption that there's no Trump supporters among you. I'd be curious if there is a Trump supporter among you, how you're responding to our using Trump as this example. But what I've learned from my relative is Trump's appeal to humiliation. I have a good friend, an analyst here in New York, named Alan McLeod, and who's not at all a Trumpist, but long before Trump was on the political scene. Alan taught me that he said analysts don't pay nearly enough attention to humiliation. It's a major emotion, and there's almost no literature on it.
Well, shame isn't what shame?
No, shame is not the same as humiliation.
Oh, okay.
No, but anybody who's gone through middle school should understand humiliation and attempts to avoid it.
Right.
Yeah, that'll do it. Humiliation will do it. Yeah.
Humiliation is being treated as if you're non-existent.
Yes.
It denies your humanity, it denies your very existence. And Trump, there's always humiliated people. Hitler had his pulse on the humiliation of the German people. Yes. Germany went through two huge humiliations. They lost the First World War, and then the middle class was wiped out during the Great Inflation. Everybody's savings was wiped out. And millions of Germans felt completely humiliated. Men felt ashamed they couldn't support their families. Men felt ashamed they'd lost the war. Excuse me. And Hitler identified that, and he offered a way. You have no reason to feel humiliated. You are Germans. You're a master race. We're the natural rulers of the world, and so on. The rest of the Hitler rhetoric. We are the superior people. And through that identification, Trump sensed that same kind of humiliation among the people who've been left behind. People in sunset industries, the coal miners. The coal miners in America were under John L. Lewis, who was one of the most liberal unions in the country and strong supporters of FDR. The coal mines shut down, and these men who would earn good money, worked hard doing dangerous work that result in long-term damage to their bodies. So men of considerable courage, and it's also skill. I forget, I think it was 48 when Truman, during a coal miners' strike, Truman threatened to nationalize the mine and send in the army. And John L. Lewis said, they'll all die down there. They don't know how to do it. It's a highly skilled job. So these brave, highly skilled men had their industry wiped out. Coal's dead. And they feel humiliated. I'm making a gross generalization, but there's a major sense of humiliation, and we're being scorned and looked down on by these elitists who think they're better than we are because they're in the growth industries. They do STEM. And Trump is latched onto them, somehow knows how to speak to that. But other people thought they could speak to it, and they're not listened to. Why Trump? I don't know. Read Wilhelm Reich. He's wonderful.
Wilhelm Reich. I must say, I think that we happen to have had our 11-year-old granddaughter here today, and she is going through hell. She's a very bright, very pretty, very smart girl. She's going through hell.
I agree.
And that's what Ray Gurley just said, the humiliation of the middle years.
Yeah.
So true. It's and so tragic.
I think the meanest group of people on earth are 11 and 12-year-old girls.
I'm going to quote that to my great.
Talk to any 6th, 7th grade teacher. They'll tell you that they're lovely, charming, sweet little girls when they're 5 or 6. They'll be lovely, sweet, charming young women when they're 15 or 16. But when they're 11 and 12 years old, they're mean as snakes. Why? I don't know. That's somebody who knows more about developmental psychology can answer that. And they are cruel to one another. And one of the techniques they do is to humiliate. They, in the current slang, they ghost a person. They just make the person non-existent.
Right. How do you know that, Richard?
I have a daughter.
Oh.
She's 46, but she was 11 and 12 herself, and she was on both ends of it. I was horrified to see her do it to other girls, but she was also the victim, as all of them are.
God, never knew that.
Nicole never told you. Nicole, how come you never told Jack that?
Yeah, how come?
I don't remember experiencing that.
But you were in
I don't know why.
You were in France.
Well, but it wouldn't be any different.
I don't know.
That happened to my daughter also, and they had to pull me away because I was going to her house to beat her up.
Right.
It was awful. And yet I'm sure my daughter did the same thing, so.
God.
I don't know why. That shouldn't have to be, but it is.
Actually, I'm reminded of a quote from, I don't know, some famous writer who said, said to maybe it was the analyst in doesn't matter, but he said, you will find that you survive humiliation, and that is an experience of incalculable value. Does that sound familiar to you? Yeah.
That does sound familiar.
No,
I think who? Yeah. Well, there was a play by, I can't think of his name, very famous writer. My memory is gone. The Cocktail Party. I think it was by T.S. Eliot.
T.S. Eliot.
Yeah, and that was a line from that. Yeah. Fascinating experience, Richard. This whole thing.
but in defense of 11-year-old and 12-year-old girls, it's the society that does that to them. So there. Not
Okay.
certainly not their mother.
Certainly not their mother. I was waiting for somebody to come to the defense of 11 and 12-year-old girls.
I just wanted to share a story about with you about Clinton and charisma and the and resistance. I had a girlfriend years ago who was really angry with Clinton for something. And she would go on and on when he was president going, I can't stand him. And she would rant and rave. Well, he was coming to Rosemont College for a visit, and her family was really big there. And she got to go to the reception to meet him, and she was going to tell him off. And she got up in line, and she was the next in line, and she's ready to tell him everything. And the next thing, he came and he said, hi, what's your name? And as he held her hand, and she said, Mary. And he said, Mary, what a pleasure it is to meet you, my dear. I can't tell you how nice it is to see you and that you came tonight. And she said, I couldn't say a word. She said, I just looked at him and I just smiled and shook his hand. And she said, I walked off, and she's never said another bad word about him again. She said, every time I thought about him, I just said, I saw the look in his eyes when he looked at me.
He was a magician. He was absolutely a magician.
So the resistance to say everything, it was gone. She couldn't say a word.
I met Richard Nixon in 1960. A meeting is the wrong term. I had an encounter with Richard Nixon. I was this far away from him purely by accident. And I had exactly the opposite experience that I had with Clinton. I wanted to go home and take a shower. It was some people have it and some people don't. Although that my repulsion at Nixon speaks to his charisma. He was not as charismatic for as many people, but there were a handful of people Nixon was highly charismatic for.
Richard, I'm just thinking that you said something like this earlier today, that charisma cannot be ascribed to a single human being. It's a relationship between a person and the enchanted, whoever they are. No?
Yes, that's
They're both. That's
the stuff that part of my paper was all stuff that Weber did not say that I thought he should have. I'm being competitive with Weber, one of the greatest thinkers of all time, but I'm being competitive with him there. What he wrote on charisma is brilliant, and just discovering the whole concept and developing it. But he didn't say everything that could have been said, and I think should have been said. And that's one of the two most important things he left out. That I correct, I'm being really grandiose here. What was the fact that it's a two-party thing. You need the enchanted, or otherwise you don't have a charismatic leader. And this index of revulsion, that if you don't feel anything, the person isn't charismatic. The charismatic leader is either loved or hated. Nobody's indifferent.
So when we talk about charisma, are we also talking about leadership? They feel like they're not the same.
Another Venn diagram.
Okay.
Huge
Okay.
overlap. Zohm really discovered, the church historian, around 1900, really discovered charisma in trying to understand the basis of authority of the early Christian church leaders.
Right.
A natural leader, one who doesn't need title, is charismatic. Everybody else needs the title: general, president, CEO, principal of the school, whatever it might be. And many people in positions of leadership are not leaders.
That's true.
They have power, and they will lead using their power. But people follow them in a passive aggressive way, or people are not being really led, they're being compelled at gunpoint or whatever. That's not leadership. But it's leadership, but it's not charismatic leadership.
So the other thing is, I mean, history has does not look at women a lot in many ways from a historical standpoint. And so it makes me wonder about charismatic women. And
I was wondering about that too. As
we,
I was preparing these remarks, I could only think of examples of, on a national level, of in political leadership, of charismatic men. Handful of exceptions: Maggie Thatcher in England, Indira Gandhi, the women who became leaders of their countries. There's very few of them, and for the most part, they weren't highly charismatic. Hillary Clinton's charisma was based almost entirely on being Bill Clinton's wife, I think. Though my wife went to a luncheon that was a fundraiser for the Democratic Party, and a wealthy friend of hers had bought a table, and my wife got to tag along. And my wife went in, lifelong Democrat, she was going to vote for Hillary, but not with real enthusiasm. And my wife came back from that luncheon saying that Hillary really moved her. Just when she spoke, she got it. Just something about her at that moment. How much of that was hereditary charisma? How much natural charisma? Who knows?
right.
Women have not been in positions of leadership in organizations of women. There's certainly been charismatic women.
Sure.
But in terms of having authority, and that's Sohm's word, the German historian's word, in a position of authority over men throughout history, there just hasn't been that many.
No, like I'm thinking Queen Elizabeth, right? The royals, right?
The royals, but that's hereditary charisma.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would say,
but Don?
I would say Joan of Arc was a charismatic woman.
Good, terrific.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And possibly Eva Peron as well.
Right. Although she's a marginal case because she was the wife of the.
She inherited, but
she inherited.
I think
Joan of Arc is the purest example. I don't know why she didn't come to mind. An 18-year-old peasant girl, illiterate peasant girl, was put in a position of leadership over an army of warriors. Convinced the king to let her lead the army. I don't think there's ever been anything else like that in all of history. Thank you, Don.
What about Frieda from Reichmann?
Well, or
say it again.
What about people like Frieda from Reichmann?
I don't know Frieda von Reichmann.
She was during the she was married to Eric Fromm for a while and joined up with Harry Stack Sullivan's.
Yeah.
And her book on the principles of intensive psychotherapy was a textbook for a couple of generations.
Yes, I remember her now.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if that's part of the issue, whether the extent to which not as many women are charismatic, and the culture that doesn't acknowledge the role of those women and to the same degree.
I think it is a cultural issue, and as we become a more egalitarian society, I think there are going to be more Elizabeth Warrens.
I think if I may add one more, Harriet Tubman would be considered charismatic.
When you start trying to think of it, when you make a conscious effort to remember and to look for those folks, they pop up all the time. That's one of the things that I love about teaching history at PSP is I keep the more I get digging, the more I keep meeting people that I never heard of before, who I say to myself, my God, they were brilliant and amazing.
Well, it's certainly been lots of brilliant women, but I'm talking about positions of leadership and saying things are listened to. Like Harriet Tubman, and Don, you're on a roll here, and Joan of Arc.
Yeah.
And two remarkable women, given these were not natural. They had nothing hereditary in their power base at all.
Right.
Because I did think about Anna Freud, but to talk about hereditary.
I was thinking about Anna Freud too, absolutely.
What about Eleanor Roosevelt?
Yes. Also, but also the wives of charismatic leaders.
There you go.
Are often charismatic, and Eleanor Roosevelt had her own charisma. But had Eleanor Roosevelt married Sam Schwartz, I doubt if she would have emerged as the kind of national leader that she did emerge as.
Golda Meir. Golda Meir.
Oh.
Golda Meir, yes.
Yeah.
But these are all people of power.
Yeah. Golda Meir, I think she did have charisma. I don't know how much she used to change people's minds. I'm trying to stick with the Weberian definition, the power to persuade. Golda Meir was pretty much a mainline Israeli politician in terms of her politics.
Yeah, I have a thought about Hillary Clinton, and that is that I think she had a lot more charisma than she was able to display, because she had a lot of ideas about how she should behave and what she should believe, which inhibited, I think, her charisma. I say this partly because that was my reaction to her, and partly because I had a patient years ago who used to go to this very expensive vacation island. You remember the name of it? Anyway, very expensive. You probably know about it. And he would go there every year, and the Clintons would go there every year. And he came back saying that Hillary was much more talkative and more interesting than Bill in that setting. So I thought it was interesting.
Early in Barack Obama's political career, when he was running for the state Senate in Illinois, my sister and brother-in-law, who live in Chicago, went to a fundraiser. And my sister walked out and said, "We just had dinner with the first Black president of the United States." And my brother-in-law said, "To hell with him. She's going to be the first woman president of the United States." That Michelle just knocked his, and my sister concurred. Michelle has a kind of natural attractiveness, certainly, that just overwhelmed my sister and brother-in-law and really impressed them. But once again, I don't know if they have the power to say what Barack Obama had the power to say, a Black man can be president. Pretty hard message for a lot of Americans to swallow, and he sold it. That's real charisma. But in terms of other ideas, I don't know. he sold American people on some watered down version of national health care. But other than that, he didn't sell people on a lot of unusual ideas. The big one, he'll stand forever, having convinced white people to vote for a black man for president. That's an act of monumental charisma.
At the risk of introducing a topic with just a couple minutes to spare, but I'm curious how, we've talked a lot about politicians, and then we've also talked about psychoanalysts, but there hasn't been any mention about celebrities who aren't politicians. And I don't know how much that fits into the Weberian definition of the power to persuade, but if you think about certainly the most famous person, I'd say, outside of maybe Donald Trump himself in America right now, has to be Taylor Swift. And I do have teenage daughters. And then I think about, the collegiate now going pro sports star. I see in the chat, somebody mentions Oprah Winfrey. I mean, when you get into celebrities, you think of all these people with this unbelievable natural charisma, when you're in their presence, and it's like, what are
There's
they?
even a term for it, which parallels. It's funny, as a charisma became a synonym for attractive, we had a need for a word, and the word that was coined, I didn't mention, I was considering going into it, make my paper too Byzantine in structure, influencers. An influencer is charismatic by definition. That's really the modern American word for charismatic. And these celebrities are tremendous influencers. They don't seem to follow, though, the pure pattern, because I don't know anybody who hates Taylor Swift. For example, I know people are indifferent to her. I'm not saying everybody loves her and thinks she's the greatest thing that ever was, and would be, if Taylor Swift said everybody should wear pink or whatever, however she's influenced. I don't know anything about her. But I've never heard anybody say they hate her and they wish she were dead, and they're just obsessed with their hatred of her.
Trump hates her.
Trump, okay. Well, because she's attacked him. That's not an anti-charisma.
Well, he fears that she has the power to sway her followers to Biden.
Right. That's a rational fear. She does have power to be used against him. But no, any neutral person. And
it isn't just Trump. It's the right wing. She's at the center of a number of right wing conspiracies at this point.
Is she? Don, you know all this stuff. Okay, then she does have charisma.
Yeah, and they've switched from her. When she was considered a country music star or whatever, they liked her, and then she moved, or they suspect her of moving to the other side. Yeah,
she's a traitor.
Yeah, they hate her.
I'm not glad to hear it for her sake, but I'm glad then she's genuinely charismatic. Oprah probably is the same thing. I think there are people who really hate Oprah.
Assuredly.
Although I think some of that isn't so much her personally as it's a racial thing. There's this brilliant, articulate Black woman who's risen up from abject poverty and is worth billions of dollars and has tremendous power. And I think that I'm pontificating stuff I don't really know, but I sense that a lot of the hatred of Oprah is not a counter charisma, but a racist response. But maybe Oprah is genuinely charismatic also.
Well, Dr. Friedman, I'm mindful of the time. Is it okay if we
run over?
Close at this point?
I want to thank you personally, Lisa. You've been terrific in helping me through all this process, and I want to thank PSP for inviting me to give this talk and to organize these. This is stuff I've been thinking about for years, and I never would have brought it to fruition had you not invited me to give this talk. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. This was a fascinating discussion, generated a lot of thoughts and ideas. And I think we'll all be looking for a future paper about this if you move in that direction. I want to let everyone know that we will have the recording available hopefully tomorrow. Everyone will get a communication with the link to the recording. Just a final note that along with that link, an invitation for you all to consider joining our summer reading workshop, A People's History of Psychoanalysis, which Dr. Wally Fletcher will be leading. Thank you, Wally. Do you want to say anything about that? That's coming up in about a month.
Well, thank you for mentioning it, and welcome all. It's a great book, and thank you, Richard, for sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
Terrific.
You've been a wonderful group of people to share these ideas with, and I've learned from all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Take care.
Have a good